What's up, everybody, and welcome to your video lesson on the American Revolution. Alright, so the first big thing that you need to know about the American Revolution is that it took a lot to actually make it happen. Because we're so familiar with this story, we tend to feel like this was something that was always bound to happen from the time that settlers set foot on the North American continent, but that's really not true, and up until and even through the American Revolution, there are tons of loyalist Americans that really don't want to break off of Great Britain. Our founding fathers and the early Americans did not come upon this idea lightly, and it took a long time to actually make the choice to split from Great Britain. So a great place to start when you talk about the factors for the causes of the American Revolution is the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Remember, this is where we meet a young 21, 22-year-old George Washington as the French and British begin to have a land dispute over the Ohio River Valley. As this happens, a long and protracted war over the span of 4 continents breaks out that ends with Great Britain acquiring a ton of land from France on the North American continent and leaving them with basically nothing but a few islands in the Caribbean. Now, this war is kind of an ugly win for Great Britain. The colonists are thrilled with it. They feel like they did great, but Great Britain is not very excited about the way that they won this war. And in particular, they are not excited about what they had to spend in order to win it. This war and all of Great Britain's new possessions really puts them in tremendous debt. In order to pay for this debt, they had to raise taxes on the American settlers. To Great Britain, you can see why this is kind of a common sense thing. Look, we fought a war on your continent, we protected you from the French, the least you can do is help us pay for it. But the problem with this is that in 1763, Britain passes the Proclamation of 1763. In this, they say that Americans can't expand west past basically what they already have, particularly into that Ohio River Valley that those American soldiers just fought for. This was mostly to appease Native Americans who were not happy to be under British rule because they sided with the French in the war. Now remember, an important point, not all Native Americans sided with the French in the war, notably the Iroquois Confederation sided with the British, but for all intents and purposes, most natives are going to be on the French side of this war, and they are not happy whenever settlers start to move into that Ohio River Valley and move west further into the Americas. So the settlers are already not happy about the fact that they can't move west into that Ohio River Valley or further west past mostly the territory that they already have. Compound this with the fact that Britain starts to pass a series of taxes on what we would consider relatively mundane things, but things that at the time were extremely important to the settlers. The Sugar Act of 1764 was one of the first of these kinds of acts. Then you get the Stamp Act in 1765, a little bit more consequential. All documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and books are taxed. The Sons of Liberty organize to fight the new tax. They protest, boycott, and they even perform acts of violence against stamp agents in the Americas. In 1766, Britain is going to repeal this Stamp Act, mostly because nobody in the Americas is actually willing to enforce it if the Americans are going to be this belligerent in their opposition to it. But along with that Stamp Act repeal, Britain passes the Declaratory Acts, which basically says, hey, you win this round, Americans, but don't forget that we have the right to tax you because we are your mother country. Don't forget who's in charge here. And in that vein, in 1767, Britain passes the Townshend Act, which is a tax on the import of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. This is killer for merchants in the area, and on top of that, Britain is not really now allowing the Americans to trade with other countries through the Navigation Acts, which was something that technically they had never really been allowed to do, but Britain turned a blind eye to it in what we call salutary neglect. All of these tensions lead to the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fire into a crowd of protesters. Crispus Attucks, an African-American man, is killed, one of 5 killed in the Boston Massacre. A couple of important guys, Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, used the Boston Massacre to ignite hatred against the British, and John Adams, future president, is going to defend those British soldiers in court. Now, in 1773, we get the Boston Tea Party, where some Sons of Liberty, dressed very loosely as Native Americans, dump English tea into the harbor in protest of taxes. Now, in 1774, we get the Intolerable Acts. This is where the British actually closed Boston Harbor. They canceled the Massachusetts Bay Charter, which has been around since 1630, and then on top of that, they forced colonists to house British soldiers. In response to all of this, you get the First Continental Congress, where delegates from all colonies except Georgia meet to discuss and create a Declaration of Rights to King George, where they are going to explain to him their grievances as a group of colonies. Notably, colonial militias are told to get ready because something might be brewing. Now, in April 1775, we actually get the Shot Heard Round the World, where some Minutemen engage at Lexington with General Gage's troops, a British commander, and the British are actually forced to retreat to Concord. So that's why you hear Lexington and Concord as probably the first battle of the Revolutionary War. With the Revolutionary War brewing, we finally get the Declaration of Independence. At this time, there is a very, very popular pamphlet going around called Common Sense by a guy named Thomas Paine. This was greatly influenced by Enlightenment thought and the rights of all individuals. Common Sense spread all over the colonies and was must-read material for new patriots and people thinking about joining the cause of liberty. The Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, and they actually appoint George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. George Washington shows up for the Second Continental Congress in full military garb, so I think he kind of wanted that job. And realistically, he was pretty much the only dude who was ever going to get it. So on July 4th, 1776, after a whole lot of debate on what should actually go into it, the Declaration of Independence is signed. Now, a few major ideas behind the revolution, and this is really, really important. First off, republicanism. Basically the idea that in a just society, all citizens willingly subordinate their private selfish interests to the common good. This was inspired by Enlightenment philosophers Rousseau and John Locke. Within this idea is the big idea that the stability of a society and authority of government depends on the virtue of citizens. Are your citizens good? Then you can probably have a good society. Are your citizens not good, not virtuous? Well, it's going to really be hard to make your society run. Then there were the radical Whigs. They feared the threat to liberty posed by the arbitrary power of the king and his ministers relative to elected representatives in Parliament. They warned citizens to be on guard against corruption and conspiracies against their rights and liberties. But remember, at this time, there are still a ton of loyalists in the country, and they are not on board with this cause. They don't want to split from Great Britain, and they would not refer to themselves as patriots of America. And on a very practical note, something that you probably already understand, Great Britain at this time had probably the greatest army in the entire world. One of the things that we read in class was a loyalist simply saying, listen, if you want to split from Great Britain, you're not going to be able to do it because we just watched as Great Britain beat the French and they beat Spain. What exactly are they going to do with a bunch of merchants with pitchforks here in the American colonies? But because of the colonists' ability to unite under the idea of liberty, you were able to get upper class and lower class people to unite under this idea of liberty and individual rights. That, coupled with George Washington's unbelievable leadership of the Continental Army, leads to American victory in the Revolutionary War. This war is going to last roughly 1775 to about 1781, but that date is a little bit fuzzy, and the Americans are going to get a considerable amount of help from the French. Now, it's really important to note, and this is an under-discussed side of this war, during the American Revolution, there's going to be an increased awareness of inequalities in society, which motivated some individuals and groups to call for the abolition of slavery already. Just about 100 years before it actually happens, you're going to see some groups already during the American Revolution calling for an end to slavery, but also you're going to see women who really helped in the American Revolutionary War effort. They were a big part of the American Revolution. They had all kinds of Enlightenment ideas. There was also this idea of what we call a Republican motherhood, that it was women's primary job to teach basic American values and Republican values in the home, and this is going to give women a slightly increased role, and more people are going to start calling for more and more rights for women because of their role in the war effort. One last note, remember that whenever the American Revolution happens, it is going to lead to a whole lot of other countries declaring independence as well. France, Haiti, and a lot of Latin American countries are going to declare independence based on the American model. So that's an extremely short version of the American Revolution. If you're frustrated that we didn't discuss any major battles, remember that neither does the AP test. The AP test is really not worried about battles, so we don't have time to discuss a whole lot about it. But if you're interested in that, go do some more digging.
Jesus.